In our previous videos, we have looked at how the first 4 features of Component 1, lesson preparation, can be integrated into a literacy lesson. Today, we'll look at a math lesson containing those same features. However, our focus for the video is on the 5th feature of lesson preparation, adapting content to meet all levels of student proficiency. The lesson I have planned comes from the 4th grade Math Expressions curriculum, Unit 5, Lesson 2. As I look at my teacher manual, I can see the content standards that will be taught throughout this lesson. These standards, along with the activity focus for each activity, is what I use to help craft my content objective. For every lesson, there's also a vocabulary list. Students can utilize the glossary at the end of the book or the e-glossary found within Think Central to gain access to the definitions of the vocabulary words. As I begin the lesson, I'm utilizing this first part of the lesson as a content check to ensure that the content concepts are appropriate for my students' age and educational background. I cannot assume that because my 4th grade students are using a 4th grade textbook, they're ready for the content. If they're not, I plan to extend this conversation to help prepare my students for the lesson. When I reach the first 2 exercises of the lesson, students are intended to work in small groups. This is a place where I modify my groups to ensure that students that did not appear to be ready for the lesson are mixed in with students that are more comfortable with the content. As I move through this lesson, I continue to look for places where supplementary materials are helpful for my students. The topic of the lesson lends itself to hands-on materials, and it's important that the materials I use are something my students are familiar with. Throughout this lesson, you'll also find various places with language objectives. Here you can find language objectives that state what students should be able to explain after the activity is complete. As I move forward in my lesson, I get to a spot in the lesson where I need to stop and decide if the work students are about to do is accessible to all of my students, or if I need to adapt my content. This portion of the lesson requires both reading and writing, all while doing error analysis. When I look at the can-do descriptors for reading and writing, I can see that the skills that are needed for this task far exceed what my students are academically prepared for. All of our English language students have varying levels of proficiency in the different domains of listening, speaking, reading, and writing. The can-do descriptors help me to determine what my students should be able to do within each domain based on their current proficiency level. I have uploaded this page into Seesaw to allow for audio recordings and recorded text. By opening the opportunity to speak instead of write and listen instead of read, students that find their strength in speaking or listening are given an opportunity to be more successful. In the past, I may have provided students with a graphic organizer to structure their writing. However, while looking at the can-do descriptors for writing, I know that a graphic organizer is not accessible to my Level 1 students. These students will find more success with answering questions with a one-word answer and copying short sentences. I provided sentence stems for my students to use to help structure their writing. Math talks are spread out throughout all of Math Expressions. It's important that I plan different opportunities for students to respond during class conversations. I intentionally provide different levels of spoken support for students, including providing opportunities for yes and no answers, simply restating facts, or using claims to persuade other students. When I take time to intentionally plan how I'm adapting my lesson to meet the needs of all of my students, I'm allowing all students access to this conversation. Activity 3 brings in real-world problems. I know from past experience that my students are most likely going to struggle with this activity. I've adapted the directions on Seesaw to include 1-step directions for my Level 1 students and 2-step directions for my Level 2 students. I've also reworded the word problems to include simplified language. The goal of adapting content and text is to make the text accessible and simplified without watering down the material. Also, by simply uploading this assignment into Seesaw, I can now allow students to use their voice to record audio and dictation to narrate their thoughts. Throughout Math Expressions, you will find English learner supports. This example shows how you might talk with your students about matter versus math and the types of responses you may expect for an emerging, expanding, or bridging student. Our challenge for you is to consider how you might adapt your content to meet the needs of your students. Be sure to use the can-do descriptors to help you gauge what's appropriate for each of your students.